You're listening to World Class from the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. We bring to you in-depth expertise on international affairs from Stanford's campus straight to you. I'm your host, Michael McFaul, the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. Today, I'm talking with Amichai Magen, a scholar of law, governance, and international relations at Reichman University in Israel. Although he's a longtime friend of us here at FSI and CDDRL. In fact, we even wrote a book together, edited a book together many moons ago. He's an alumnus of the Stanford Law School and formerly a fellow here and scholar at the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. But most recently, he has rejoined us at FSI as the inaugural fellow of our newly launched Visiting Fellows in Israel Studies program. What great timing, Amichai, that we have you today. Literally in the newspapers I was reading this morning, I still get one physical, just so you know, I'm really old school. The future of Israeli democracy has been in the headlines here in the United States. And we want you to help us understand what is going on. So welcome to World Class.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's great timing for me personally. Not so happy days for Israel, but we'll try to make sense of what's going on.
Well, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, we could go back many decades or even thousands of years. We don't have time to do that. But I think our listeners and viewers know that there's a crisis in democracy in Israel. We're reading what's happening politically. We're watching these incredible demonstrations. I want to talk about the societal reaction too. But it's pretty complicated. I got to tell you, even for me, it's pretty complicated. So start where you want, but help us understand how Israel got to the moment in terms of this crisis. And Amichai, don't even use the word crisis if that's the wrong word, but help us understand how we got where we're at today.
Yeah, it is complicated, Mike, because Israel, like any political system, is a complex system. There are all these variables interacting with one another: societal, institutional, personal, regional, international. All these things are interacting as they do in any political system. But in Israel, that tends to sort of be on steroids, and things have been moving so quickly that we could spend an hour on what's happened in the last 24 hours, but we can't do that. And I think it is very, very important that we have some context. And I'll try to simplify things, but I'll try to give a little bit of context. I think we need to understand the current crisis, and it is a crisis in the Greek sense of a sort of a moment of change and of crisscrossing paths, and that Israel could go down different paths from here. But in order to understand this, I think we need to tackle a paradox that is at the heart of Israeli democracy. And the paradox, I think, goes as follows. On the one hand, Israel is it's an established democracy. It was born as a democracy in 1948. In many respects, its democratic culture goes back to the pre-state institutions. It's proven itself to be durable and resilient. We've never experienced a military coup or any other kind of breakdown of Israeli democracy, despite numerous wars and security challenges, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. So this has been a country that from very inauspicious circumstances has not only survived, but thrived as an open and pluralistic and society. And if you and I, Mike, looked at Israel this time last year, we would kind of be in awe of the country. Let me just give you just a few statistics. In 2022, Israel was the fastest growing economy in the OECD. It was already.
I did not know that. The fastest of all OECD countries. Wow. I did not know that.
The fastest growing economy in the OECD. It bounced back from the pandemic with remarkable speed. It was doing incredibly well. It became the 18th wealthiest society in the world. Israel achieved a GDP per capita that was higher than that of Austria and Canada and Belgium and Germany. it was ranked as the fourth happiest country in the world. So Israel was thriving. Israel was doing extremely, extremely well. And yet, and here I come to the other side of this paradox, for several decades now, but especially over the last 3.5 years, there's been a sort of a brewing sense of what can only be called a kind of an identity crisis. Okay. And I think a lot of vulnerabilities that were hidden from view, that were sort of in the background, were coming to the fore. And I think we can spend a lot of time in trying to figure out why that is. Is it social media? Is it sort of a resurgent identity politics that we see not only in Israel, but in the United States and in many other countries around the world? We can spend a lot of time sort of analyzing why this sort of vulnerability and why this particular kind of moment of crisis emerged when it did emerge. But I think what we have to sort of bear in mind is that culturally and institutionally, Israeli democracy was always vulnerable. Okay, and I'll try to explain that.
Help us understand why. Yeah.
Well, it was always very vulnerable, I think, for cultural, but also for institutional reasons. So culturally, Israel is a country where the majority of the population that immigrated to Israel did so from North Africa, the Middle East, but also places like Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, etc. So the vast majority of the Israeli population really came from societies that didn't have very strong democratic cultural traditions. That was also true of Israeli elites. You know, the founding fathers and mothers of Israel did not come from England or from Philadelphia. They came, again, from Ukraine and Poland and Russia and from North Africa and the Middle East. And to add to that, Israel was born and has lived in the Middle East in a neighborhood that, as you know, is sort of devoid of other democracies and sort of lacks a kind of regional underpinnings of democracy. So that vulnerability was almost always there. And in retrospect, perhaps the cultural democratic roots of Israel were not as deep and not as well entrenched as we may have thought, or as was reflected in international indices of the quality of democracy, the rule of law, and governance. That's a question that I think we need to put on the table, and the answer to that question, I think, has profound ramifications for the depth and durability of Israeli democracy. But at the same time, and I think this really brings us to the current crisis, Israel has some real institutional vulnerabilities when it comes to democratic stability. Israel has no fully codified constitution. It has very few formal checks and balances. We've been reliant on norms and what Montesquieu or Alexis de Tocqueville would describe as mores of democracy, on what is done and not done in democratic politics. And there's a sense in which those mores have been eroding, and we've become more polarized, and our elites have become more open to experimenting with non-liberal, more authoritarian forms of politics, more populist forms of politics. Just to complete this picture, I think that for 75 years, Israel has decided not to decide on some of the critical questions that are normally settled in constitutional conventions. So we don't have formal rules on separation of church and state. We decided not to decide on whether the ultra-Orthodox in Israel should serve in the army or not serve in the army. We decided not to decide what should be the relationship between the Jewish majority and the Arab Israeli minority that makes up 20% of the Israeli population. So there's a variety of issues that
those are big, hard issues. Those are not little issues. Those are big ones.
Those are really, really big ones. And again, Israel has done pretty well by fudging those issues, not bringing them to the fore, and essentially trying to sort of focus on mundane bread and butter politics issues, but in a way, those questions of identity are really bubbling, and they're really coming to the fore right now. And I think that provides us, Mike, with the context that helps us to understand where Israel is right now in terms of strengths and vulnerabilities. If Israeli democracy were to falter in 2023, 2024, that would be more akin to the faltering of British democracy or Canadian democracy or indeed American democracy than it would a country like Turkey or historically kind of Russia, because of that long democratic tradition. And you were referring to these extraordinary demonstrations, this unbelievable mobilization of Israeli civil society, which I was personally involved with my family and my friends and my colleagues until we traveled here to Stanford 2 weeks ago. But you're talking about somewhere between 3 and 5% of the entire Israeli population that for the last 6 months, every week, goes out into the streets very peacefully, families, children, to stand up for the rule of law, to stand up for making sure that Israel continues to be an open society and a thriving democracy. That is a real strength, but we find ourselves confronting a coalition government today that wants to take Israel down a different path.
Well, let's dig a little bit into what the coalition government's trying to do. The superficial reading is the majority, but it's a small majority in the parliament, wants to limit the powers of the Supreme Court, and that's unconstitutional, even though there's not a written constitution, as you already explained. But that violates the checks and balances between those two, in American parlance, the judiciary versus the parliament. I'm sure it's way more complicated than that. So help us understand exactly what the prime minister is doing and the vote that just happened recently in terms of the balance of power between these two sets of institutions.
No, Mike, I think you've captured it brilliantly. In essence, like the British parliamentary system, the Israeli executive emerges out of the legislature. So we don't have a real separation of powers between the legislative branch and the executive branch. Whoever controls the Knesset controls the government, and vice versa, which means that the only real formal check on executive power in Israel is the Israeli Supreme Court, or more broadly, what I would define as the Israeli legal establishment, which includes not only what is so far and historically and even today remains a very robust and a very independent Israeli judicial branch, but also the position of the Attorney General and the legal counsel officers that provide legal counsel to the Israeli executive in every single governmental department that you can think of. Now, the big difference between the United States and Israel and in this regard, and the United States in this regard, and this is something that's important to understand, is that in Israel, the legal advice of the Attorney General is legally binding upon ministers unless and until the Israeli Supreme Court rules otherwise. So we're talking about a very powerful Attorney General office, and the crux of the issue really has to do with the desire of this coalition government to remove some of those checks and balances that in the Israeli context can only be imposed by the Supreme Court through judicial review and by the Attorney General's office. And that is really the crux of the matter. So there's a whole variety of legislative proposals. Some of them are kind of on hold right now. Some of them are making their way through the Knesset. One of them was just passed by the Knesset yesterday. But the bottom line is that
and tell us what happened before you get to the bottom line, just because it's hard for us who don't understand the system to follow. what passed, and I saw
Yeah.
all the everybody walked out who didn't vote for it. What exactly happened there that they were so animated about that they would walk out of the Knesset?
Yeah. So what happened yesterday was that a bill proposing to essentially eliminate one of the causes of action that historically has been used by the Israeli Supreme Court to review appointments, whether those would be ministerial appointments or senior civil servant appointments. That cause of action is called the reasonableness cause of action. This is an administrative law instrument that Israel adopted from the British common law system, which essentially says that this is called Wensbury unreasonableness, that if an elected official or a civil servant makes a decision that is so outrageous, that is so unreasonable, that no reasonable politician, elected official, or appointed official would make such a decision. Let me give you, an example. That all red-headed people would need to live in a particular neighborhood, right? Or to make it more realistic, that the prime minister can appoint his son to be the attorney general without the court being able to review the reasonableness of that decision. Historically, the Israeli Supreme Court has relied somewhat on this cause of action in order to strike down those types of decisions. It hasn't done it many times. We have some data on this. So this was a cause of action that was used, I believe, 22 times over the last 20 years. But it acts as a deterrence and essentially sends a signal to the executive saying,
better not
there are
do
certain,
this.
right, but there are certain things that you cannot do. And what happened yesterday was that the coalition government managed to pass by a vote of 64 members of Knesset. We have 120 members of Knesset, so this is a bare majority. They passed a bill that essentially removes the ability of the Supreme Court to invoke that cause of action in order to review executive decisions.
Got it. And remind everybody who appoints the Supreme Court?
Well, the Supreme Court in Israel is appointed like every other court in Israel, every other judicial appointment. We have a committee, a judicial appointment committee that combines representatives from the government, from the opposition, but also from the judiciary and the Israel Bar Association. So this is
very complex.
and this is, yes, and it is a system that has been looked at by other countries around the world as a model for how you achieve professional appointments that enjoy broad consensus. And it's interesting that you've mentioned that, because one of the changes that the current coalition wants to make is a change to the Judicial Appointment Committee that would essentially give the governing coalition a majority over judicial appointments. So that's another one of the changes that they want to introduce.
Right. And that's why there's been, and I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that the Supreme Court is popular as an institution within Israeli society, or is it more divided in terms of their attitudes towards that? Well, here in our country, as you know, the Supreme Court's reputation has gone way down recently. Is that true in Israel or not?
Yes. So just like in the United States and in other democracies, we have seen a decline in popularity and trust of all government institutions, including the executive, the legislature, and the Supreme Court. However, the Israeli Supreme Court still enjoys far higher rates of popular trust than the executive or the legislature in Israel. In fact, the only institution in Israel that enjoys higher levels of popular support is the IDF. It's the Israel Defense Forces.
Right.
I believe that is similar to the United States. The military is seen as a sort of a national unifying institution above the fray of politics. But I believe that it is the Israeli Supreme Court comes right after the IDF. Yeah.
Interesting. So is there a way out? Is there a fix? Is there an institutional fix or a political fix that you see that this might be resolved, or do you think this is going to go on for a while?
Well, I don't know. I think that the current situation is one of growing mistrust and what I would call toxic polarization. Again, this is not unique to Israel. I think we're seeing something similar happening even in places like, Holland and Sweden and Germany. Mike, as you know, there's something in the air that is driving mistrust and polarization and a kind of collapse in public trust in elected authorities all around the world. And that is something we need to do a better job in understanding, let alone fixing. So Israel is afflicted with that at the moment. Clearly, a moment of crisis is also a moment of opportunity.
Right.
We do see in the public polling, and we have very reliable public polling in Israel, that if the elections, if general elections were held in Israel tomorrow, Netanyahu would lose. Levels of support for Likud and for his coalition are declining. And so I think that is sending an important message to the current coalition. But at the moment, I think, particularly given the vote in the Knesset yesterday, and the sense that many Israelis have that this particular government is not really interested in broad dialogue and consensus, I don't see a short-term fix. But I do see this crisis potentially worsening. There are alarm bells going off in terms of international credit rating companies. Moody's just published a report essentially warning Israel that if it continues down this path, its credit rating may suffer. We've seen Israeli reservists, pilots, people who serve in special units, signing petitions and announcing that they will not serve in Israel that is not free and democratic. And so
that's pretty alarming.
That is very, very alarming. And right now, these very hours, the Israeli security establishment is assessing the seriousness of that and seeing whether this is something that might undermine Israeli national security. So there are plenty of signs being sent to Netanyahu and this government that would suggest that this might be a good time to take a breather and to reconsider. In the longer term, I'm going back to this issue of fudging and the fact that Israelis have decided not to decide. I think that in the longer term, we are already having, but we will have a very rich and very energetic public conversation about the need for clearer rules of the game. And I think that there are sort of two possible ways forward with that. One, we might call this sort of a thick constitutional moment versus a thin constitutional moment. I don't want to get too wonkish about this, but one way forward would essentially say, hey, we've really taken the country to the brink. We understand that we can no longer avoid these questions, and Israel really needs a constitutional convention. We really need to get together and to decide and to set in place a codified constitution that will define what does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish and democratic state. What does that actually mean? I think that's going to be very, very difficult, but we may be moving towards some kind of arrangement in which Israelis try to put together what I would call a thin constitutional settlement, which would essentially say, well, we might not be able to, decide on questions of separation of religious and
Right.
religious state, we may not be able to legislate a sort of a full Bill of Rights or to decide what should be kind of majority-minority relations in Israel. But at the very least, we should set in place the procedural rules of the game to make sure that we have stronger guardrails for
Right.
how we're going to conduct our national politics. And I think there's going to be quite a lot of pressure for Israelis to move in that direction. It might happen in one sort of grand bargain, but I think more realistically, we will see a series of incremental changes of finer-grained reforms that will try to put in place those guardrails. So
Right.
I think that is the space to watch over the coming months and years.
Interesting. So finally, why should communities outside of Israel be interested or invested in these issues? And what role do you think programs like ours, the Visiting Fellows in Israeli Studies at FSI, have to play in addressing these challenges?
Yeah, so the first thing to say about that is that Israel needs to hear from its friends outside of the country. I think that sometimes, especially when you have a country, a democracy that has been a democracy for a long time, and we kind of take it for granted.
Right.
There's a tendency to just say, well, you know, that's a domestic issue, and let the Israelis figure it out. I think that friends should be able to say difficult things to one another, and this is the time when the people of Israel, not only the Israeli government, but where the people of Israel really needs to hear from friends around the world, including, and I would say first and foremost in the United States, and they essentially need to hear, I think, two messages. One is that we are with you. Israeli democracy is important. We value this extraordinary mobilization of Israeli civil society. We support you, and our loyalty and our friendship is to Israel as a society and as a state, and not to a particular government or particular politician. I think it's very, very important for Israelis to hear that. And then I think it's also entirely legitimate. And this is actually, Mike, something very, very interesting. Israelis have been in very close dialogue with colleagues and friends in places like Hungary and Poland and Turkey, and have been trying to make the case to the Israeli government, but also to the Israeli public. Look at what happened to Hungary. Look at what happened to Poland. Look at what happened in Turkey. Look at what happened to Russia. This is not something that this is not a path that we want to go down. So I think that just as authoritarians and populists have their international networks and circles, we really need to strengthen the circles and the networks of support for democracy all around the world, including for Israeli democracy.
Interesting.
And we better do it earlier rather than later. Specifically, our program here at FSI, our program, the Visiting Fellows program in Israel Studies, I think can do a number of really, really important things. I had the great pleasure and honor of teaching a course on Israeli politics this past academic year. It was fantastic. The students were amazing, and one of the great pieces of advice and feedback that I received from our students is that they really appreciated the insider view and the understanding of how Israeli politics actually works. So I think we can make a really valuable contribution in explaining, as you can see, Mike, it's a complex system, it's a dynamic system, and so one of the things that we can do is to provide a better understanding of how Israel actually works as a political order, as a political system. And Israel is an important country increasingly in its own right, you know, whether we're looking at governance or cybersecurity or energy, entrepreneurship, innovation. This is a country that punches way above its weight regionally and internationally. I think it's very, very important for us to understand Israel as Israel. But secondly, we need to look at Israel comparatively, and we need
Right.
to connect. We need to connect the dots and say, hey, what is going on here? Why are incredibly successful open societies undermining the very institutions and values that have given them success for so long? Why is it that societies from Germany to Sweden to Holland to France to Italy to the United States to Israel, what is it about this historical moment that is getting these incredibly successful societies that have thrived within a liberal mindset and a liberal international order? Why are we undermining the very values and institutions that have given us this tremendous success? And I think that's something that we don't understand, that we really need to work on together. Let me mention one more reason why I think this is incredibly important. The fate of Israel and the strength or weakness of Israel will have repercussions not only for US foreign policy and for Israel itself, but also for the Middle East and the broader international system. Iran is watching what is happening in Israel very, very, very closely. Hezbollah is watching very, very closely. Hamas is watching very, very closely. The UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia are watching this very, very closely. We've managed to make tremendous progress in Middle Eastern peace based on the understanding that Israel's neighbors have that Israel is a powerful and cohesive and coherent international actor. And if that is undermined, then we could find ourselves in a much more precarious regional and international environment with very serious consequences for energy markets and for stability in the Middle East and Europe and beyond. So I think for all of those reasons, it's great. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity that FSI has provided us to be able to explore this country and the various issues that it presents us.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think we're really lucky to have you. We would have been lucky to have you any year, but to have you during this period, it's tremendous. Thanks for coming on World Class. And I guarantee you it's not the last time you're going to be here, because I don't think this crisis is going away anytime soon. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Mike.
You've been listening to World Class from the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. If you like what you've heard, please leave us a review and be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on what's happening in the world and why.